She counted the bullets before she counted the men. 92 rounds of match grade 6.5, Creedmoor, hand-inspected, casing polished, each one sitting fat and patient in 3 magazines pressed flat against the foam lining of the legacy storage crate. And outside the razor wire of Obsidian Range, 92 heavily armed mercenaries were grinding up the canyon road in matte black tactical vehicles, fully convinced that the only living soul left inside this dying Nevada base was a logistics clerk too frightened to run. They had no idea that the logistics clerk had been counting them since the first headlight crested the ridge. Master Sergeant Elena Vance did not look up from the crate when the distant thunder of twin turbine engines finally faded into the frozen dark. The last Chinook helicopter had lifted off 40 minutes ago, its rotor wash whipping her silver-streaked hair across a face carved from granite in controlled fury. The final transmission from Major Garrett Thorne had arrived with the casual cruelty of a death sentence read by a bored bureaucrat. Leave Vance behind. She is baseline inventory. Expendable fodder. She will not make it past dawn. She had not flinched. She had not chased the red taillights dissolving into the freezing fog. She had simply turned around, walked back into the bunker, and begun her real inventory check. The one they did not know she had been conducting for 3 months. Obsidian Range had been carved into the jagged limestone plateau of the Nevada high desert like a wound that never fully healed. In its prime, it was a testing crucible for experimental ballistics and long-range combat doctrines, a place where smart officers burnished their records and ordinary soldiers broke their bodies against the unforgiving rock. Now, 18 months after the Department of Defense quietly defunded the site, it was a concrete carcass, 43 acres of abandoned barracks, gutted communications bays, and perimeter fencing that rattled like loose teeth in the constant mountain gale blowing down from the 4,000-foot peaks. They had sent her here as a punishment. Major Garrett Thorne, immaculate in his dress uniform, had smiled that greasy, patronizing smile and handed her a clipboard. Her only job, he explained, was to count diesel gallons and sign off on obsolete spare parts while the real operators went out to play real war. The insubordination charge on her record, the one she had never contested, because contesting it would have required explaining what she had actually seen in the Kareem Pass operation, made her permanently untouchable, a liability dressed in a supply sergeant's patches. They had stripped her name from the active rolls at Fort Bragg and replaced it with a forged logistics code. They had buried her under 5 feet of administrative silence and expected her to stay buried. What they had failed to account for was what she had done with 3 months of silence and unrestricted access to the base infrastructure. She knew every blind spot in the perimeter fence, every acoustic dead zone between the concrete blast walls, every ventilation shaft, drainage culvert, and forgotten service tunnel that the standard base maps conveniently omitted from the public registry. She had mapped them all on her 3rd day, walking the compound alone in the pre-dawn dark while everyone else slept, her mind cataloging angles and distances with the cold, precise efficiency of a woman who had spent a career doing exactly this in places the American public would never be allowed to know existed. The heavy steel door of the legacy storage room swung open on silent hinges. She had oiled them 2 weeks ago. Inside the windowless alcove, past the stack of classified after-action reports bearing the red slash of top-secret clearance, rested the components of her real identity, preserved in vacuum-sealed plastic and high-density foam like museum pieces of a war the Pentagon had spent a decade trying to erase. She lifted out the Mk-13 Mod 7 long-range sniper rifle, titanium chassis, matte tactical dark earth finish, designed to put a 6.5mm projectile through a walnut shell at 1,200 yards in a crosswind, and pulled the bolt back with a slow, deliberate motion. The dry, flawless slide of steel on steel was the most honest sound she had heard in 3 months. She stripped off her outer canvas jacket, tossing the generic supply sergeant patches onto the concrete floor where they landed like discarded skin. She pulled black tactical webbing over her shoulders and buckled the quick-release clips across her chest with practiced, absent-minded precision. 3 magazines in the chest pouch, a suppressed close-quarters carbine on the secondary sling, a combat knife sheathed against her left thigh. She was no longer Sergeant Elena Vance, the quiet woman with the silver hair who fetched coffee and signed off on diesel fuel shipments. She was the weapon they had tried to bury. A sudden hiss of static tore through the dead air of the Tactical Operations Center, vibrating the speaker grill of the abandoned emergency radio console on the corner desk. Elena froze, her head snapping toward the sound with the predatory stillness of a wolf scenting smoke on a mountain wind. The emergency frequency was hardwired into the base repeater, a secure military channel that should have been completely dead now that every satellite link had been rerouted to the departing battalion command post 30 miles west. But the static did not die into white noise. It sharpened, resolved itself into the rhythmic staccato chatter of a digital burst transmission, a low-bandwidth tactical ping, used by high-tier operators trying to locate an open relay without triggering perimeter tripwires. She stepped out of the storage alcove, her boots silent on the concrete, and leaned over the console. The green line of an oscilloscope trace began spiking across the monochrome display. She toggled the frequency dial 3 clicks left, dropping into the secondary analog band that military contractors used when they wanted to speak without the National Security Agency listening in. The voice that came through the speaker was distorted by atmospheric interference and wind scraping across a directional antenna, but the tone was unmistakable, clipped, professional, entirely devoid of hesitation. Sector 4 is wide open. The logistics coordinator is the only thermal signature left on the grid, and she is dead weight anyway. Move the heavy transport through the ravine. Let the dust settle and burn the barracks before the noon patrol checks the manifest. Elena did not blink. She listened to the voice fade back into static, her face expressionless, her mind already calculating distances, wind drift, and approach vectors with the cold clarity of a targeting computer processing battlefield telemetry. 92 men, 2 heavy transports confirmed in the canyon, more vehicles staged further down the access road, waiting for the lead element to clear the gate. They thought she was a ghost in an empty house. They had never looked closely enough to see the tripwire attached to the handle. She picked up the MK-13 by its pistol grip, walked out of the communications room into the main corridor, and began the long, quiet climb toward the sniper perch she had prepared on the roof of the Central Observation Tower. 14 days ago, the wind howled through the ruined communications towers above, a high-pitched keening that scraped against the nerves like steel wool on raw bone. She did not hear it anymore. She was already thinking about shot sequencing. The lead vehicle ground to a halt 50 yards outside the rusted chain-link perimeter fence, its diesel engine vibrating the earth with a low, rhythmic thrum that rattled loose gravel against the concrete apron. The passenger door creaked open, and a man in unmarked multicam fatigues stepped out into the biting desert wind, his assault rifle at low ready, his eyes sweeping the darkened compound with the bored confidence of a professional who had cleared 100 dead bases exactly like this one. He raised his tactical headset. Sector 1 is clear. No thermal signatures at the gate. The logistics clerk must have hitched a ride with the last supply truck. Sweep the barracks, torch the server rooms, and let us get this done before the sun hits the ridge. Elena lay prone on the concrete parapet of the observation tower, her cheek pressed against the composite stock of her MA-13, her right eye behind the high-magnification thermal scope. Through the crosshairs, the operator below was a warm, white silhouette moving with practiced efficiency across the cold gray concrete of the motor pool. She tracked his movement, calculating the wind drift off the western ridge at a steady 6 knots, her breathing slowing to a rate that barely moved her chest. She did not shoot him. Not yet. She needed them deeper inside the compound, past the secondary checkpoints and into the concrete labyrinth, where the base architecture worked entirely in her favor. She waited while a second man cut the padlock on the main gate with hydraulic bolt cutters, the heavy chain parting with a sharp snap that echoed across the courtyard like a pistol shot. She waited while the lead vehicle rolled through onto the motor pool tarmac. She waited while 6 more mercenaries dismounted from the second transport, their hands full of portable incendiary canisters and sledgehammers. The tools of men whose job was to ensure that an abandoned military base disappeared from the historical record without leaving awkward evidence for congressional investigators. She gave them time to feel safe. The lead operator stopped near the entrance of the communications bunker, directly beneath the shadow of the observation tower, and reached for his radio with the casual arrogance of a man who had never once faced a cornered animal. "Setting up the thermite charges now," he said. "Base is completely dead. Vance is nowhere, probably frozen in the hills, trying to walk out." A bark of laughter crackled through his earpiece from one of the drivers by the transport vehicles. It died the instant the first shot broke the night. The crack of the MK-13 was a single, devastating syllable spoken in the language of finality. The lead operator never registered the impact. The 6.5 millimeter round struck the center of his ceramic chest plate with a kinetic force that lifted him completely off his feet and dumped him onto the concrete in a boneless heap before the sound of the shot had even finished echoing off the surrounding buildings. The second operator spun, his weapon coming up, his eyes sweeping wildly for a muzzle flash that did not exist. Before his finger reached the safety switch, Elena's second round tore through his tactical vest and drove him into the side of the truck, where he slumped against the front tire without making a sound. The courtyard erupted. The remaining 8 mercenaries dove behind concrete barriers and vehicle doors, their rifles swinging upward to blast wild, blind streams of lead into the upper stories of the administrative buildings in the dark hillsides. Their radio frequency, which Elena had already slaved her receiver to monitor, became a wall of overlapping screams. "Enemy in the tower! Sniper on the roof! We are taking fire from elevation!" She had already moved. She rolled 6 feet across the concrete to a secondary firing position behind a crumbled parapet. Moving before the first return, fire chewed up the exact spot where she had been lying half a second earlier. She reloaded with the fluid, mechanical grace of a machine built for one singular purpose. The dry click of the bolt sliding home, swallowed entirely by the howling wind. They were shooting at shadows, wasting ammunition against empty concrete while she counted the remaining 10 men, 8 in the courtyard, 2 still in the vehicles, and began adjusting her plan accordingly. 30 miles to the west, in the subterranean command bunker of the regional defense sector, Major Garrett Thorne's voice cut through the chaos of the comms net like a blade through wet paper. "What do you mean, sniper?" Thorne roared through the encrypted channel. "There is no one out there. The base was cleared 48 hours ago. It is just the logistics clerk. Find her and put a bullet in her head right now." On the ground, the mercenary team leader, a grizzled contract veteran named Briggs, who had survived 3 separate civil wars across Central Africa, pressed his back flat against the concrete wall of the supply depot, his chest heaving as he tried to reassemble his shattered formation. "Shut up and listen to me," Briggs said into his throat mic, his eyes darting across the courtyard where his 2-point men lay motionless in the dust. "She is not a clerk. Nobody in logistics drops 2 men at 600 yards in total darkness without a muzzle flash. That is a suppressed match-grade weapon, fired from elevation with 0 wind drift errors. She is a trained ghost operator, and she has us pinned in the open with our backs to a fishbowl." He slammed his fist against the wall. The base layout was a horseshoe design, high ground on 3 sides, 1 narrow exit road back down the canyon. They had walked directly into a kill box designed by men who understood military fortification at an architectural level. And the woman sitting on the high ground had spent 3 months learning every square foot of it. "2 teams," Briggs whispered into his radio, "move through the service tunnels beneath the motor pool, flank the central tower from the basement access. Flush her or drop a grenade down the stairwell. The rest of you, suppressive fire on the upper windows. Pin her down." Elena heard the shift in their formation through the subtle vibration of the concrete beneath her boots, the way the enemy element fractured as 2 separate groups broke away from the main vehicles and began crawling toward the maintenance access hatches near the motor pool. She knew those hatches. She had mapped them on day 3. She slung the MK-13 across her back, slipped off the roof edge into the exterior fire escape, and descended into the dark like a drop of oil sliding down polished glass. The service tunnels beneath the motor pool smelled of stagnant water and ancient rust, lit by emergency lamps that pulsed with a dying amber glow. Briggs' 2 flankers moved through the corridor in a tight, aggressive stack, their weapon lights cutting through the damp air, their fingers twitching over triggers as they swept every doorway and pipe junction. They expected to find a frightened woman hiding in a corner with a pistol. They did not hear the whisper of a boot on wet concrete above them, because there was no boot above them. Elena was behind them, hanging from the overhead ductwork by the locked crooks of her knees, her silenced carbine aimed at the rearmost man's cervical spine. She dropped, both knees wrapped around the mercenary's neck with the torque of a hydraulic press. The snap was immediate and clean. She caught his dead weight before his knees could strike the floor and eased him down into the shallow puddle of rainwater pooling in the corridor. The second man turned too slow. The suppressed barrel of her carbine pressed against his chest plate before he could bring his rifle up. A single muffled thud. He folded against the wall and slid down without a sound. She retrieved her blade, checked the tunnel intersection ahead, and pressed forward into the deeper network toward the motor pool apron, where Briggs's command element had established their forward operations post. Above ground, in the courtyard, the surviving 8 mercenaries were burning through ammunition at a rate that told her they had approximately 6 minutes of suppressive fire left before the panic set in completely. She needed to move faster. She found the drainage culvert she had identified during her second week at the base, 48 inches of concrete pipe running directly beneath the motor pool apron, its iron mesh grate spot welded into the floor of the eastern maintenance bay. She dropped flat, pulled herself through by her elbows and toes, and emerged beneath the rear chassis of the heavy black transport truck where Briggs stood leaning against the bumper, trying to light a cigarette with trembling fingers while the wind kept killing his lighter flame. She came up behind him before he heard a single footstep. Her left hand clamped over his mouth with the crushing efficiency of a hydraulic vise. Her right drove the combat knife upward beneath the ceramic plate of his vest with clinical precision, severing his diaphragm in a single fluid motion. She held him upright for 3 seconds, lowering him gently onto the mud without a sound escaping his throat, and leaned down until her lips brushed his ear. 92 men, she whispered, minus 11. Your math was always going to run short, Briggs. She stripped the secure tactical radio from his chest rig, slipped it into her own pouch, and melted back into the shadows of the motor pool. 20 seconds later, one of the perimeter guards turned, saw his team leader slumped against the tire tread, and the last thread of discipline, holding the mercenary formation together, snapped clean through. The courtyard became a war zone of blind, panicked gunfire. 20 rifles simultaneously destroying their own vehicles, shattering their own headlights, punching holes through the barracks walls they had come to burn. They were fighting the dark, and the dark was winning. Elena was already on the rungs of the water tower on the northern perimeter, climbing fast. From the platform 30 meters above the compound, she laid the MK-13 across the sandbags she had staged there 10 days prior and settled her cheek against the stock. Through the scope, the halogen floodlights Briggs had ordered cranked to maximum power flooded the courtyard in blinding white, a tactical decision that had eliminated his men's night vision while doing nothing to expose the woman watching them from elevation. She acquired the primary fuel line feeding the auxiliary generator. Gentle, imperceptible pressure on the match-grade trigger. The sear broke with the crisp snap of a dry twig underfoot. The bullet crossed 600 yards in less than half a second, punched through the rubber fuel hose, and struck the sparking generator terminal with enough kinetic friction to ignite the aerosolized diesel instantly. A muffled roar shook the northern perimeter. A wall of orange flame billowed into the night, turning the blowing sleet into a curtain of gold and crimson that illuminated the entire compound in a single breathtaking second of artificial daylight. In that second, every surviving mercenary looked up. They saw her silhouette on the water tower, tall, immovable, the long rifle resting against her shoulder like an instrument of divine accounting, and not one of them raised a weapon. The primal recognition washed over them like ice water. They had not been abandoned in an empty base by accident. They had been herded into a slaughterhouse. Elena worked the bolt without hurrying, placed 3 precise rounds into the snow at their feet, and keyed Briggs's stolen radio. "Leave the trucks," she said, her voice as flat and final as a headstone being set into frozen ground. "Start walking south, all of you, and tell Major Thorne that Sergeant Elena Vance is checking out of inventory with a complete accounting of every item on the ledger." She turned away from the edge of the platform, slung the MK-13 across her back, and stepped off the iron rungs into the blowing mist. Behind her, obsidian range burned like a signal fire lit for the dead. 81 surviving mercenaries walked south into the dark, and none of them looked back. The fire from the auxiliary generator painted the frozen plateau in shades of bruised amber and ash, the rising column of smoke visible for 30 miles in every direction against the pre-dawn darkness of the Nevada sky. 81 mercenaries were already disappearing down the canyon road on foot. Their tactical discipline evaporated, their expensive equipment abandoned in the mud and slush of the motor pool. Their only shared objective, the simple, animal imperative of putting as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever was standing on that water tower. Master Sergeant Elena Vance was not on the water tower anymore. She had descended before the last of them, cleared the perimeter gate, moving through the eastern maintenance bay and into the sub-level corridor network with the unhurried, deliberate stride of a woman who had a very specific destination in mind and all the time she needed to reach it. The battle outside was over. What came next was not a battle at all. It was an accounting. The Communications and Operations Center bunker was built into the limestone rib of the plateau, its reinforced walls thick enough to survive direct artillery impact. Its climate-controlled server room maintained by a dedicated generator that drew from a separate fuel line, the one she had deliberately not targeted. The red warning lights above the doorway pulsed with a steady crimson rhythm as she entered the manual override code into the digital keypad. A 12-digit sequence she had memorized during her second week at Obsidian Range by walking through the bunker after hours and reading the override sheet taped to the inside of the emergency access panel. A sheet that a busy base commander would have removed, but that a dying, understaffed installation had simply left in place. The heavy steel slab swung open on a pneumatic sigh. Inside, the server room hummed with the restless energy of systems that had been running on automated protocols for months, long after the human operators who were supposed to monitor them had been evacuated. The multi-monitor display bank still flickered with encrypted data streams, unread satellite telemetry feeds, operational logs, classified after-action reports from a decade of black-budget missions run under the authorization codes of Task Force Greystone. 10 years of evidence that the men who ordered the burial of Elena Vance had been very careful never to delete, because deleting it would have required acknowledging it existed. She did not waste time reading the files. She had seen enough of their content in the 3 months she had spent quietly accessing the legacy archive during the night shift when the remaining skeleton crew was asleep. She knew what was there. She knew exactly what it proved, and she knew precisely who needed to see it. She walked straight to the master broadcast console, stripped off her tactical gloves with a sharp pull of her teeth, and laid her bare hands on the brushed aluminum surface of the primary audio interface board. From her vest rig, she clipped the secure field recorder she had taken from Briggs' command kit during the engagement, a device authorized for Tier 1 command element use only, carrying an encryption key with priority routing access that bypassed every standard Defense Department firewall. She plugged the data cable directly into the auxiliary port of the base broadcast system. On the primary monitor, a glowing green status bar began its steady crawl across the interface window, routing her transmission through 12 secure proxy servers before hitting the primary nodes in Washington with authority that no communications officer in the country could legally override. The system was designed to ensure that critical field intelligence reached command staff even in the event of a deliberate blackout. It had been designed for exactly this kind of situation. Nobody at the Pentagon had ever imagined that the person using it would be the ghost they had tried to erase. She leaned until her lips were 1 inch from the high-gain condenser microphone, and she began. "This is Master Sergeant Elena Vance, former reconnaissance specialist, Task Force Greystone. Ghost operative, deliberate administrative erasure. Current location, Obsidian Range, Nevada. Timestamp, 0447 hours. Classification level of this transmission, wide open. 30 miles away in the subterranean command bunker of the Regional Defense Sector, Major Garrett Thorne was mid-sentence into a furious call to his corporate handler when his private speakers suddenly carried Elena's voice into every corner of the room with the crystalline, unavoidable clarity of a fire alarm. He dropped his phone. "Turn it off!" Thorne screamed at the communications technician seated at the main console, the color draining from his face so rapidly that the man beside him actually reached out to check if he was about to collapse. "Cut the satellite uplink, trace the signal, and drop an artillery strike on that bunker right now." The technician's hands moved frantically across the keyboard, sweat running freely down his forehead. Error messages cascaded across his screens in angry red. "I cannot sever the line, sir," the technician said, his voice cracking under the weight of what he was reading on his display. "She has hardwired directly into the primary defense routing matrix using a Tier 1 encryption key. If I attempt a manual override, the system's failsafe will automatically transfer every classified file on this facility to the Armed Services Committee Chairman's secure server. All of it. Everything." Thorne's hands gripped the edge of the metal desk until his knuckles turned the color of old bone. "In the server room at Obsidian Range," Elena continued, "for 10 years, the men who run Task Force Greystone have used the concept of deniability as a corporate balance sheet. They have written off soldiers the way a company writes off bad debt, quietly, administratively, with a rubber stamp and a sealed file. Soldiers who asked inconvenient questions about extraction orders that left civilians in the line of fire. Soldiers who refused to sign off on operations that violated every legal and moral framework they had sworn to uphold. Soldiers who survived missions they were never supposed to survive." She paused, let one beat of silence sit in the transmission. "My name was removed from the active roles at Fort Bragg because I witnessed what happened at Cream Pass. I was buried under a forged logistics code in a dying desert base because the men who made the decision at Cream Pass were afraid that a living witness was more dangerous than a dead one. They were correct. I am transferring the unredacted operational archive of Task Force Greystone, every mission log, every illegal extraction order, every financial transfer from the black budget slush fund to the offshore accounts of the private contractors who carried out the wet work, to the following recipients." She read 7 names into the microphone. 2 were investigative journalists. 3 were senior members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. 1 was a federal judge who had been requesting declassified Greystone materials through official channels for 2 years and receiving nothing but form letters in response. The last was the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. She reached out with one finger and pressed the master execution key. The status bar flashed green. The transmission was complete. The archive upload had begun routing through the decentralized proxy network, distributing copies to all 7 recipients simultaneously in a data package that could not be recalled, edited, or suppressed by any classification authority in the United States government. It was not a leak. It was a detonation. She pulled the data cable free, lifted the manual override panel on the console's secondary housing, and drove the butt of her combat knife hard into the central circuit board. A sharp crack, a brief cascade of sparks. The server bank's hum climbed to a sudden high pitch before dying into absolute silence as the voltage surge fried the internal systems one row at a time. The monitor screens going dark in a slow, definitive wave that moved left to right across the display bank like the closing of an eye. She replaced her knife, pulled her gloves back on, and walked out of the communications room without looking back. The heavy steel door locked behind her with a pneumatic thud that sounded, in the profound silence of the empty bunker, remarkably final. Outside, the sleet storm was breaking. The howling mountain winds were dropping to a low, mournful sigh, and the first pale bands of dawn light were beginning to seep over the jagged eastern ridge of the Nevada range, painting the frozen compound in shades of bruised gold and deep violet. Elena walked out into the center of the ruined motor pool and stopped. She stood in the silence for a long moment, her breath pluming in the cold air, her hands resting at her sides. Around her, Obsidian Range was still. The abandoned barracks, the scorched northern perimeter where the generator had burned itself out, the rusted razor wire that rattled softly in the dying wind. The base looked exactly like what it was, a place that had been used up and thrown away. She knew the feeling. She unslung the MK-13 from her back and held it in both hands, looking at it the way a craftsman looks at a tool that has done its final job well. Then she slung it back across her shoulder and turned toward the access road. There was a vehicle waiting at the interstate junction 4 miles south. She knew this because she had arranged it 10 days ago, communicating through a dead-drop protocol with a contact she trusted more than she had ever trusted a rank insignia. The contact's name was Marcus Webb, a former senior intelligence officer who had spent the last 12 years in self-imposed exile in the Idaho mountains after refusing to authorize the Cream Pass extraction orders that had set everything in motion. He had been watching for her to move ever since the day her name disappeared from the Fort Bragg rolls and reappeared as a logistics code at a dying Nevada test site. I had known, even then, what it meant. She walked without hurrying down the center of the access road, her boots crunching over frozen gravel and shattered glass, the morning light growing stronger around her with every step, the silhouette of the burning base growing smaller in the empty air behind her. She did not look back at it. She had already taken everything from Obsidian Range that mattered. At the property line, the access road intersected the empty ribbon of the interstate highway, stretching north toward Montana and south toward Arizona. An unmarked, dust-covered pickup truck with Montana plates sat on the gravel shoulder, engine idling, its exhaust rising in a straight white column in the still morning air. On the passenger seat, a heavy canvas duffel bag, a fresh set of civilian clothes, and a handwritten envelope. She recognized the handwriting before she even picked it up. Marcus Webb's jagged, precise military script. The pen pressed hard into the paper the way men write when they want the words to carry weight. She opened the envelope. "They are looking for you in all the wrong places," the note read. "Thorne is too busy explaining his bank accounts to a federal grand jury to think about anything else. The committee thinks you went south toward the border. Take a breath, Elena. You earned it. The porch light is on." Tucked beneath the note was a photograph, an old Polaroid, faded at the edges, taken 22 years ago during their first shared deployment in the mountain ranges of Central Asia, when they were young enough to believe that the flag on their shoulders meant exactly what the oath said it meant. She was 26 in the photograph. Webb was 30. Neither of them had silver in their hair yet. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. Not warmth exactly, something closer to recognition, the acknowledgement of a debt finally coming due. She placed the photograph in her chest pocket, climbed into the driver's seat, and guided the truck out onto the empty highway. The morning sun was fully above the ridge now, flooding the open road ahead with hard, brilliant light that made the asphalt shimmer like water in the distance. Behind her, 30 miles back in his command bunker, Major Garrett Thorne was being placed under federal arrest. The military police had arrived at 05:15 hours, 14 minutes after Elena's broadcast completed its routing to all 7 recipients. The federal arrest warrant had been authorized by a duty judge who, after reading the first 40 pages of the Greystone operational archive on his secure server, had called the duty marshal at 04:58 and told him not to wait for morning. Thorne did not resist. He sat very still in his chair, while the MP sergeant read him his rights, staring at the dead monitor screens with the blank, hollow expression of a man who had spent 10 years constructing a fortress of institutional protection and was only now understanding that every brick of it had been made of sand. Elena did not know the precise details of his arrest. She did not need to. She knew the system well enough to understand that the moment her broadcast cleared the proxy servers and the archive upload completed its routing, Thorne's career, his freedom, and the network he represented were already over. The machine she had set in motion at 4:47 in the morning would not stop for the convenience of the men it was designed to destroy. She pressed the accelerator gently and watched the miles roll away beneath her. The high desert landscape began giving way to rolling green foothills as the highway curved north, stands of ponderosa pine appearing along the ridge lines, distant mountain peaks catching the morning sun. She drove without music, without the radio, without anything but the steady hum of the engine and the white noise of wind against the windows. For the first time in 10 years, the silence did not feel like a punishment. The gravel track leading to Marcus Webb's cabin was barely visible beneath 3 inches of fresh pine needles, the kind of deliberate obscurity that a man cultivates over 12 years, when his primary survival requirement is that no one should be able to find him quickly. Elena guided the pickup along the winding path by memory. She had studied the satellite coordinates from the envelope a dozen times during the 4-hour drive north, until the track curved around a stand of ancient western cedars, and the cabin appeared in a small clearing overlooking a rushing mountain stream. Webb was on the porch. I was older than this photograph, as she had expected. Broader through the shoulders, slower in the way he held himself, not infirmity, but the deliberate stillness of a man who had learned to spend his energy carefully. His white hair was cut short, his face deeply lined, and he watched her park the truck and climb out with an expression that combined 12 years of guilt with 12 years of relief in equal measure. He said nothing until she mounted the porch steps and came to a stop 2 feet from him. "Welcome home, Sergeant," Webb said quietly. His voice carried the gravelly warmth of an old commanding officer who had long since abandoned the pretense of professional distance. "I kept the coffee warm." "You always did make terrible coffee," Elena replied. But the drive was long. He held the door open. She picked up her canvas duffel, slung the MK-13 case over her shoulder, and walked into the cabin. The interior was warm and cedar-scented, a sanctuary of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, topographic maps pinned to raw wood walls, and the steady ticking of a grandfather clock that measured time in a way that had nothing to do with military schedules or congressional deadlines. A wood-burning stove threw amber light across the room. Elena set her duffel by the door and accepted the ceramic mug Webb placed in her hands with both of hers, feeling the heat spread through her palms and up through her wrists, banishing the residual cold that had been living in her joints since the high desert night. She moved to the window overlooking the porch and the pine-forested slopes rolling down toward the stream. The afternoon light was warm and horizontal, the kind of light that only exists in the mountains in the late hours of a clear day, turning everything it touches briefly golden. "You made a considerable amount of noise back there in Nevada," Webb said, leaning against the kitchen counter with his own mug, his eyes on her face. "The Armed Services Committee has already convened an emergency session. The defense contractors are shredding documents by the truckload, which means they are destroying evidence, and the federal investigators know it, which means the obstruction charges are going to stack on top of everything else in the archive. Thorne is in federal custody. His defense attorneys are filing motions to seal the proceedings under national security exemptions." Elena did not turn from the window. "They will not succeed," she said, "not with 7 independent recipients holding authenticated copies of the archive. You cannot seal evidence that has already cleared the firewall on every secure server in the building." Webb nodded. "Correct, which brings me to the part of this conversation that the envelope did not fully explain." He set his mug down on the counter and walked across the room to the wall safe hidden behind the largest topographic map, North American continent. Full detail, the kind of map that a man pins to his wall when he intends to keep track of many things happening in many places simultaneously. He spun the brass dial with slow, deliberate clicks and pulled open the heavy steel door. Inside, a collection of encrypted flash drives, satellite communication relays, authenticated transfer orders bearing the digital signatures of individuals currently positioned deep within the Defense Logistics Agency and the National Security Council. In a single titanium-encased data module the size of a matchbox sitting at the center of the safe's contents like the stone in a ring. He placed the data module on the oak table between them. "Task Force Greystone was not a program, Elena," Webb said, his voice dropping in register the way men's voices drop when they are saying things they have been carrying for a long time and are finally setting down. "It was a template. The men who built it understood that the fundamental operational problem with black site work is the human element, the operators who survive. Greystone was their solution, a systematic methodology for erasing the record of people who could not be allowed to have records. And when Greystone was finished, when its official mandate expired, the architects simply moved the methodology into a new administrative structure and started again under a different classification code." Elena turned from the window. "How many?" Webb's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes tightened. "Across 3 programs, spanning 11 years, 47 soldiers confirmed erased from active roles and relocated to cover assignments. Of those, 19 are confirmed dead under circumstances their families were told were accidents or natural causes. The remaining 28 are alive. Most of them do not know the others exist. None of them have ever been told the full scope of what was done to them or why." He tapped the titanium data module on the table. "This contains everything: financial trails, offshore accounts, the operational logs of all 3 programs, and the authenticated signatures of the 11 senior officials who authorized each iteration. It also contains the current location and status of all 28 surviving operatives. They are waiting, most of them without knowing they are waiting, for someone to come back to them with the truth and the legal standing to give them their names back." Elena picked up the data module and felt its weight in her palm. Small enough to close her hand around completely, dense enough to destroy careers that had survived every official oversight mechanism the government had thrown at them for over a decade. Thorne was one name on a long list, she said. He was the architect on the ground. The men who designed the template and authorized the 3 programs are still sitting behind mahogany desks in Washington. Webb nodded once. They are preparing to manage this as a controlled burn. Sacrifice Thorne, sacrifice the mid-level contractors, issue a classified internal report acknowledging procedural irregularities at Obsidian Range, and use the report itself as a reason to seal the primary Greystone archive under national security protections before the congressional hearings can subpoena the full record. Elena set her empty mug on the table beside the data module. They think the story ended when the transports fled down the canyon road. Webb's jaw tightened. They have been thinking that for 11 years, every time they tied off a loose end and moved to the next operational cycle. They think in terms of containment because they have never faced a situation that could not be contained by institutional authority. She looked at the data module for a long moment, then at the wall safe, then at the satellite communication relay sitting in Webb's weathered leather case on the table's edge. We do not upload the full archive at once, Elena said. The systematic surgical approach that had governed every decision she made in the compound now applied itself naturally to the larger problem, her mind moving through it the way she moved through a kill zone, with patience, with sequencing, with an absolute refusal to expend a round before the target was in the optimal position. We release it in time phases. Force them to deploy their legal resources, defending the first revelation while the second hits their flank. Then the third before they can regroup. We make it structurally impossible for them to seal any portion of the record without the act of sealing it becoming additional evidence of the larger conspiracy. A rolling information barrage, Webb said, his eyes steady on hers, against men who have only ever known how to fight behind paper walls. They will not know where the next round is coming from until it has already punched through. Webb offered a slow, grim nod. There is something else. In the data module, a secondary file, the 19 who died. Their families received official notifications describing accidents, training incidents. One case of cardiac arrest at the age of 31 in a man whose physical fitness evaluations were all in the top 3% of his cohort earned for a decade running. The file contains the authenticated evidence contradicting every official explanation. The families deserve the truth, Elena said. That was not a question. No, Webb agreed quietly, it was not. She picked up the data module and slipped it into her tactical vest pocket, zipping it closed with a motion so practiced it was nearly unconscious. She walked to the corner of the room where the padded travel case containing the M13 rested against the wall and laid her hand flat on the reinforced lid, not a gesture of threat or readiness, but the simple acknowledgement of a tool that had served its first purpose and was now waiting for the next one. We leave in the morning, Elena said. First phase of the data release routes through the Zurich and Reykjavik proxy nodes. Same architecture I used at Obsidian. It reaches the independent investigative syndicates at noon Eastern, simultaneous with authenticated copies going directly to the legal representatives of the 19 families. The families hear the truth at the same moment the press receives the evidence. Neither story can be killed without killing the other. Webb was quiet for a moment. Then, you planned this before tonight. I planned the broadcast at Obsidian Range 2 weeks ago, Elena said. I planned this part of it 10 years ago, the day they erased my name and expected me to accept it as a fact of nature. She moved toward the window again. Outside, the mountain shadows were lengthening as the sun continued its descent behind the western peaks, the light turning from gold to rose to a deep, bruised violet that settled over the pine forest like a held breath. They built the system, she said. They wrote the operational doctrine, established the funding structures, identified which human beings were disposable assets and which ones were protected, and they did it using the authority and the resources of a government that belongs to the people it was disposing of. They thought the lesson of Task Force Greystone was that the methodology worked, that if you are thorough enough, systematic enough, and institutionally protected enough, you can make a person disappear so completely that no one ever comes looking. She turned from the window. Her eyes were very clear in the fading light. The lesson of Obsidian Range is different. Webb held her gaze. What you leave behind in the dark, she said, does not disappear. It waits. The grandfather clock in the corner marked the hour with a single resonant stroke that seemed to travel all the way through the walls of the cabin and out into the silent mountain evening. Webb walked to the table, picked up his leather case, and began quietly preparing the satellite relay for morning. The pre-dawn darkness over the Idaho foothills carried the metallic scent of frost and pine resin and the distant sound of the mountain stream in the valley below. Elena stood on the cabin porch and watched the horizon transition from black to deep violet to the first pale bruise of approaching dawn. Inside, Webb was already moving, boots on the floor, the leather case latched, the satellite relay powered and running its initialization sequence through the Zurich proxy. She reached into her chest pocket and pulled out the old Polaroid photograph. 22 years, two young officers in a mountain range that had not been kind to them, wearing the flag that had not been kind to them either, looking at whoever was holding the camera with expressions of absolute, uncomplicated confidence in the institution they represented. She had not felt that confidence in a long time. She was not sure she felt it now, precisely. What she felt was something harder and more specific. Not faith in the institution, but absolute clarity about the obligation. The 28 surviving operatives, the 19 dead, the families who had been told carefully constructed lies and asked to grieve without understanding what they were grieving. She put the photograph back in her pocket next to the titanium data module. Webb appeared in the doorway behind her. The first packet is queued, he said. Zurich Reykjavik routing, timed for noon Eastern. The family notifications route separately through authenticated legal channels simultaneously. Once we initiate, there is no recall. I know, Elena said. He held out her ceramic mug, refilled, still too strong. She took it. They stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the mountains where the first light was beginning to catch the ice crystals on the pine needles and throw them back as scattered points of cold fire against the dark. The architects of the three programs, Webb said, the 11 who authorized the methodology, and when the data phases release, some of them will attempt to use their executive positions to claim immunity from congressional subpoena. They will not succeed, Elena said. Not with authenticated financial trails showing offshore transfers, and not with the testimony of 28 living witnesses who have nothing left to lose and every reason to speak. And if they try to run, she looked at him. Then they will discover that I am not the only ghost who knows how to find people who do not want to be found. Webb was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly, the committee is going to want you to testify. On the record. Your name restored to the active roles, full witness protection, the complete declassified account of Cream Pass. I know. It will not be safe. Elena almost smiled. Major, she said, I spent 3 months alone in a dying desert base, counting diesel gallons and waiting for 92 armed men to come and kill me. Safe is not a condition I plan my life around anymore. He nodded once slowly with the particular gravity of a commanding officer acknowledging something that no longer requires his authorization to proceed. The mountains were fully lit now, the peaks catching the risen sun and throwing its light down across the valley in long, brilliant bands that reached the cabin steps and spread warm across the porch floor at their feet. The frost on the pine needles was evaporating in thin wisps of steam, the air smelling sharply of cold water and earth in the raw green bite of living wood. Elena finished her coffee, set the mug down on the porch railing. She went inside and picked up her duffel bag, her rifle case, and the leather satchel containing the communication relay and the encrypted drives. Webb was already at the door with his own case. They walked out together into the morning, down the gravel path to the waiting truck, and Elena loaded everything into the back with the careful, unhurried economy of a woman who has learned not to rush the things that matter. She climbed into the driver's seat. Webb took the passenger side. She started the engine, let it idle for a moment, listening to the steady, reliable rhythm of it. For the 19, Webb said quietly. For all 47, Elena answered, and for every name that comes after them if we do not finish this. She put the truck in gear and pulled out onto the mountain road, heading south toward the interstate, toward Washington, toward the 11 men who had built the system and spent 11 years believing that their position within it made them permanent fixtures of an immovable structure. They had forgotten the first rule that every good engineer understands. A structure is only as permanent as its foundation. And foundations, when the right pressure is applied at the right point, do not crumble slowly. They collapse. The road opened up ahead of them, wide and clean in the morning light, and Elena Vance drove into it without hesitation, carrying the names of the dead and the truth of the living and the absolute unyielding certainty that the inventory she had begun counting in the dark of a dying Nevada base was not finished yet. It would not be finished until every name on the ledger had been read aloud, in public, before the people who had tried so hard to ensure they would never be spoken again. She had counted every bullet in that crate before she counted the men outside the wire. Now she was counting something else, and she never missed.